Check out FlipsideGaming.com for all your gaming needs. Use the promo code HEROES to save 10% on all orders over $10. Between now and December 16th, if you use this promo code, you will automatically be entered into a drawing where 13 winners will each win one of the Flipside Gaming Masterpiece Collection playmats. See the description below for more details. Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends. In Pro Tour, Guilds of Ravnica has come and gone, but today we're going to examine the results of the weekend. We'll be looking at the decks that people brought to the tournament, how they fared as far as conversion rates to day 2. We'll be looking at the top 8 and some of the key decks from that top 8 as well. Quickly before we get started, just a fast reminder, if you check out the description below, as always, you'll find links to Patreon and product links that support us. One thing I wanted to call out in particular was the Flipside Gaming Ultimate Masters Booster Box price point right now. It's a really good deal if you use the promo code, taking it down to about $260 shipped. However, the only issue is, and I got a lot of questions about this over the weekend, so I just wanted to put it out there, they put a few boxes up at a time. They do sell out pretty quickly for pre-orders, but then they do seem to restock. They've been doing that all weekend. So my advice to you, if you're trying to find one of those for $260 off Flipside Gaming, I would simply favorite the page, check back often. Hopefully they will restock again. You might be able to grab one. So hopefully that helps some of you out there that did have that question, but let's get into today's information. First thing we're going to look at is what decks were brought into day 1 and what their conversion rate was into day 2. Few things you want to remember though about the Pro Tour before we move on. First, it is a very small tournament in the scheme of things. It's not as large as the GP or the Star City Games tournaments that we watch, so you're going to find less diversity generally in a Pro Tour, especially considering there are teams that test together, so a lot of people will be bringing the same decks to the tournament. And they're trying to metagame around a relatively small group of people and trying to guess what they think the other teams are going to play. So is it a true reflection of standard? Maybe not 100%. You combine that with the fact that 6 of the rounds are limited. So maybe you don't have the best standard deck. Maybe you have the second or third best standard deck, but you can still do very well if you can go 6-0 or 5-1 in those draft rounds. So do remember all that as we move forward and look at today's results. Now, when it comes to decks that people brought to the tournament, you can see Golgari Midrange was number 1 with 113 copies. So that was pretty prevalent. Red-White Aggro, which in a lot of cases is really more of a white aggro deck that adds a little red after sideboard. We'll look at some of those deck lists a little bit later, but there were 81 of those. Is It Drechsler was popular too with 66, Mono Red Aggro 64, Jeskai Control 56. And then it starts to break up a little bit from there. You see a lot of the decks that we're familiar with from the meta so far. There weren't any big surprises in this tournament because the Pro Tour was a little later this time. We've had some standard GPs. We've had a lot of Star City Games events. So there was nothing here that just came out of nowhere necessarily and blindsided us. These are all decks we're pretty familiar with. What's interesting here, though, is the conversion rates. Let's see how they converted into day 2. Some of the higher percentages, as you can see here, things like Golgari Midrange did pretty well with a 62.8 conversion rate. Red-White Aggro with 69.1% was solid. Is It Drake 68.2. Mono Red Aggro 67.2. Notice the control decks didn't fare as well though. Jeskai Control, which was the more popular version of Control going into the weekend with 56 copies, only 32 made it to day 2 for a 57.1 conversion rate. And other decks that did well that maybe had less copies in the field. So remember, with less copies in the field, it is easier to skew the percentages a little higher if you have some luck. And again, you're going to find things like Selesnya Tokens here with 76.9. That was really solid, but there were only 13 decks. 10 of them made it to day 2. You look at White Weenie, 8 decks day 1, 6 day 2, 75%. I could argue, though, that a lot of the red-white decks really were White Weenie decks. We'll see that in a little bit. Esper Control, 5 in day 1, 4 in day 2. That one actually did pretty good at 80%. Some of the lower ones we'll look at here. I mentioned Jeskai was a little bit lower. Mono Blue Tempo didn't do also well, 43.8% in this field. You also saw Grixis Control did really poorly, 33.3%, but there weren't a lot of decks. So it was 9 day 1, 3 day 2. So maybe a bad draft round could have contributed to some of that too. So you do want to remember that. Dimir Control, 55.6%. Turbo Fog, 44.4%. So that's a snapshot basically of what we saw over the first couple days. What about the top 8? Okay, here's your top 8. Now, not looking as diverse as we saw a couple weeks ago with the GPs by far. Boros Aggro came in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 7th. The 4th place deck, Boros Tokens, was actually pretty similar to the Boros Aggro decks. We'll look at those deck lists in a moment. Jeskai Control did come in 5th, and Is It Drakes came in 8th place. Izzet Drakes and Jeskai Control did look good over the weekend. Golgari Midrange actually looked very good over the weekend, but again, it just didn't make the top 8 in that case. And the other 2 decks, Izzet Drakes and Jeskai Control, only got 1 copy in. So in this smaller meta, we did see Boros Aggro actually doing pretty well. Now, like I mentioned a few moments ago, these Boros Aggro decks, you could argue they're white weenie decks that bring in some of the red out of the sideboard when the time comes. So let's take a closer look at some of these deck lists. We're going to look at one example of Boros Aggro. We'll look at Boros tokens as well, and then we'll look at the Jeskai Control and Izzet Drake decks. Boros Aggro, here's the first place deck. Now, a couple things I want to point out. There are differences. For example, the one that came in 7th place was running 2 Aurelias in the main, and you don't really see that from a lot of the other decks that were in the tournament, or at least the ones in the top 8 here. But that is another variant of this deck that you could look at. But for the most part, the key cards are all here, and they're going to start looking very familiar. Adanto Vanguard, Benalish Marshal, Dauntless Bodyguard, Healer's Hawk, Sky Marcher Aspirant. A lot of these were cards we saw time and time again. When it comes to the spell side, Conclave Tribunal, History of Benalia was very big this weekend, Legion's Landing. Now the sideboard is where the red starts to come into play. Things like Banefire, you got one of those in the sideboard, for example, as well as some of the cards from Guilds of Ravnica. Speaking of Guilds of Ravnica, what kind of influence does the new set have on this particular deck? Well, let's see. 4 cards in the main: Healer's Hawk, Venerated Loxodon, Conclave Tribunal, and Sacred Foundry. Out of the sideboard, here's some more red to go along with your Banefire, Experimental Frenzies, as well as Response and Resurgence. Now, there were some variations out of the side as well. Some decks were running Lava Coil, for example, but for the most part, these decks were pretty consistent. Okay, let's look at that Boros Tokens deck that came in 4th place. How different is this from those White Weenie / Boros Aggro decks we just looked at? Not very different. You're going to see a few differences that are glaring, maybe like 2 Aurelias in the main. You also get 2 Boros Challengers in the main. So this one does start off with some red right in your main, but not a whole lot. And then you see a lot of other familiar cards from the previous deck list. The Adanto Vanguard, Conclave Tribunal, History of Benalia, Legion's Landing, so on and so forth. So there are some differences, but it's a very similar deck. When it comes to Guilds of Ravnica, we had Hunted Witness, Aurelia, Boros Challenger, Conclave Tribunal, and Sacred Foundry. Out of the sideboard, we had Legion Warboss, another copy of Aurelia, Lava Coil, and Experimental Frenzy. Okay, 5th place, Jeskai Control. This is a little different, at least. This is one of the variants that was running 3 Crackling Drakes and 4 Teferis as win conditions. And as you can see from the spells here, that you're not going to see anything too surprising. Chemist's Insight, Essence Scatters here, Expansion Explosion, Ionize, Justice Strike, Negate, Revitalize, so on and so forth. We're very used to seeing this deck. So what kind of influence does Guilds of Ravnica bring? Quite a bit, 9 altogether. Crackling Drake, Deafening Clarion, Chemist's Insight, Sinister Sabotage, Ionize, Justice Strike, Expansion Explosion, Sacred Foundry, and Steam Vents. Out of the sideboard, we find Rahl, Niv Mizzet, Lava Coil, and Disdainful Stroke. 8th place was Izzet Drakes. Now, this came in 8th. We got a copy in the top 8. It looked like a really fun deck. It actually had a good weekend, so don't let that deceive you that it just came in 8th place or anything. Actually did very well. And this particular version is running Arclight Phoenixes, of course, 4 of those. Crackling Drake, 3 of those, 4 Enigma Drakes, 4 Goblin Electromancers. Not all the variants of this deck run 4 Goblin Electromancers. Some actually run none, some run 2 or 3. So there are differences, and sometimes there's advantages to having 4, sometimes there's drawbacks, but in this case, obviously, it worked out pretty well. And when it comes to your spells, you're going to find a lot of cheap ones here, like we've been seeing in these builds all along. So again, nothing too surprising for the most part. Let's take a look at the cards from Guilds of Ravnica. Again, quite a few, 9 again altogether in the main. Arclight Phoenix is one of the key cards, of course, in this particular deck. You have Crackling Drake, another one, Goblin Electromancer, like we mentioned. Lava Coil, Maximize Velocity, Radical Idea, Discovery Dispersal for the Discovery side, Izzet Guildgate, and Steam Vents. You know you're all in when you're playing the Izzet Guildgate. In the sideboard, you found Rahl, Murmuring Mystic. That was kind of cool tech. I didn't see that in all copies of this particular deck, and I thought it was a pretty good idea. Niv Mizzet's there, Beacon Bolt, Disdainful Stroke, and Firemind's Research. Okay, so not a super diverse top 8 by any means, but the tournament itself actually had a lot of diversity in the decks like we saw early on in the video. This is a small tournament, like I said. You would expect aggro decks to do pretty well at the Pro Tour. That seems to be consistent with what we've seen in recent years, so that's not too surprising. I guess we'll find out soon enough if this is truly a reflection of where the meta is going, or if it's just kind of one of those weird anomalies because it's the Pro Tour. I do think we're going to see more diversity going forward than we saw this weekend when we get to GPs and other Star City Games events. However, it is pretty late. This meta is beginning to wind down as we move closer and closer to January. And one indication of that was because the Pro Tour was so late, you're not seeing huge price spikes or anything like that. The big price movement occurred around the GPs a couple weeks ago, not necessarily this Pro Tour. Yeah, some cards are going up a little bit due to their coverage, like Arc-like Phoenix, History of Benalia, Legion's Landing, for example. But you're not seeing the big spikes that a lot of times you do see that coincide with Pro Tour weekend, just because basically those already happened a few weeks back. All right, with that being said, those are my thoughts on the Pro Tour weekend. Looking forward to see where the standard meta goes from here. But until next time, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.